June 1939, Peenemünde West, 10 a.m. The Baltic breeze carries the scent of pine and salt, but on this morning, a new, sharper smell cuts through the air. It is the acrid tang of chemicals that will soon define the most dangerous aviation experiment of the Third Reich. Beneath the silver skin of a diminutive, wing-shaped aircraft, a revolution is brewing. This is not the roar of a piston engine or the familiar whistle of a propeller. It is the scream of a rocket, a sound that signals the beginning of a terrifying new era in flight. Alexander Lippisch, a man whose mind lived decades in the future, watches from the edge of the airfield with a mixture of pride and trepidation. For Lippisch, the traditional airplane was an obsolete relic. He saw tails and long fuselages as unnecessary drag, anchors holding humanity back from the sound barrier. His vision was the flying wing, a pure aerodynamic shape that would slice through the atmosphere with unprecedented efficiency. By the late 1930s, his work on high-performance gliders at the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug had caught the attention of the Luftwaffe, not because of his love for soaring, but because the German Air Ministry was becoming obsessed with speed. The problem facing the German High Command was becoming clearer with every passing month. While their Messerschmitt 109's were formidable, they were limited by the laws of physics governing internal combustion and propeller efficiency. To stop the coming swarms of Allied bombers, they needed something that could climb like a bullet and strike with the suddenness of a lightning bolt. They needed a point defense interceptor that didn't just fly, but erupted into the sky. This desperation created a fertile ground for Lippisch's radical ideas, which had previously been dismissed as too eccentric for mass production. To realize this dream, the ministry paired Lippisch's radical airframe with the volatile genius of Helmuth Walter. Walter had developed a rocket motor fueled by a terrifying concoction known as T-Stoff and C-Stoff. T-Stoff was a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide, a substance so corrosive it could dissolve human flesh and organic matter upon contact. C-Stoff was a catalyst made of methanol and hydrazine hydrate. When these two liquids met, they didn't just burn, they exploded in a hypergolic reaction. There was no spark plug, no complex ignition system, just the violent, instantaneous meeting of two chemicals that hated to be in the same room. The project moved from the experimental gliders of the DFS to the industrial power of the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg. Here, the design was refined into what would become the Me 163 Komet. By 3 p.m. on a sweltering afternoon in 1941, the Leggery test pilot Heini Dittmar strapped himself into the belly of this beast. He was sitting on top of several hundred gallons of explosive potential, separated from an agonizing death by a few millimeters of aluminum and the hope that no seals would leak. As the engine ignited, the Komet did not roll down the runway so much as it was hurled forward by an invisible, screaming giant. Within seconds, it reached speeds that no human had ever experienced in level flight, shattering the 1,000 km/h mark. The Nazi leadership saw the Me 163 as a miracle weapon, a silver bullet that would make the skies over Germany impassable for the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. But in their desperate pursuit of high-speed interception, they had bypassed the fundamental safety protocols of aviation. The Komet was a masterpiece of aerodynamics and a nightmare of engineering. It was a plane designed for a regime that valued the result far more than the life of the pilot. The pilots were required to wear special rubberized suits, not for pressure, but to protect them from being literally dissolved if a fuel tank ruptured during a rough landing. As the war progressed and the pressure on Germany intensified, the Me 163 transitioned from a scientific curiosity to a desperate frontline reality. It was a machine born of a dark marriage between avant-garde science and total war. Lippisch had achieved his dream of a tailless, high-speed flyer, but at a cost that is still chilling to contemplate. The aircraft was so fast that pilots had only seconds to aim their cannons before they zipped past their targets. And once the rocket fuel ran out, usually in less than 8 minutes, the pilot was left in a heavy vulnerable glider drifting back to Earth. Looking back at the genesis of the Komet, we see more than just a failed interceptor. We see the birth of the jet age and the precursor to space exploration, forged in a crucible of fanaticism and technical brilliance. The Me-163 remains a haunting monument to an era where the boundary between progress and self-destruction was erased. It serves as a poignant reminder that when technology outpaces our respect for human life, the result is often a weapon that is just as lethal to the hand that wields it as it is to the enemy it was built to destroy. The legacy of the Komet is not found in its meager combat record, but in the charred remains of the men who dared to ride a controlled explosion into the stratosphere, serving a cause that viewed them as nothing more than biological components in a machine of war. July 1941, at the Peenemünde Research Facility, the Baltic air was suddenly torn asunder by a sound that defied contemporary explanation. It was not the rhythmic thrum of a piston engine or the nascent whistle of a turbojet, but a primal, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of those standing on the observation deck. This was the debut of the Walter HWK 109-509, the volatile heart of the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet. To understand the lethal reputation of this aircraft, one must first look into the chemistry of its propulsion, a system that relied on the violent marriage of two substances so reactive they required no spark to ignite. Helmuth Walter, the visionary engineer behind the project, had designed a rocket motor that bypassed the need for atmospheric oxygen, allowing the Komet to climb at speeds that made Allied fighters look like they were standing still. However, this performance came at a cost that was paid in human life and chemical burns. The propulsion system relied on a dual-component fuel strategy known as hypergolic ignition. The first component, T-Stoff, was a highly concentrated solution of 80% hydrogen peroxide stabilized with phosphoric acid. In its pure state, T-Stoff was a terrifying substance. It was a potent oxidizer that would spontaneously combust upon contact with almost any organic material. If a technician at 9 a.m. accidentally spilled a few drops on a leather glove or a cotton rag, the material would instantly erupt into a fierce white-hot flame. The second component was C-Stoff, a toxic cocktail of hydrazine hydrate, methanol, and water. When these two liquids were brought together in the combustion chamber, they reacted with instantaneous ferocity. The resulting explosion generated massive amounts of superheated steam and nitrogen, which was then funneled through a nozzle to create nearly 4,000 pounds of thrust. By 10:30 a.m. on a typical flight day, the ground crews faced a logistical nightmare. Because the two fuels were so reactive, they had to be stored in separate areas of the airfield and handled by teams wearing protective suits made of mipolum, a type of early plastic designed to resist the corrosive bite of the peroxide. Even these suits were often insufficient. The engineering of the Me-163 was a masterpiece of compromise. To save weight, the aircraft was essentially a flying fuel tank with wings. The T-Stoff was stored in a large tank behind the pilot's seat, while the C-Stoff resided in smaller tanks nestled in the wings. This meant the pilot was quite literally encased in a bomb, separated from a dissolved death by only a few millimeters of aluminum and glass-lined piping. The operational reality of the Walter engine was a high-stakes gamble that began the moment the pilot engaged the throttle. At 11:15 a.m., as the Komet accelerated down the runway on its jettisonable dolly, the pilot would feel a sustained force of 6 Gs pressing him into his seat. The rate of climb was staggering, reaching 30,000 feet in less than 3 minutes. Yet the engine was temperamental. If the fuel flow was interrupted for even a fraction of a second, the flame could travel back up the lines, causing the entire aircraft to disintegrate in mid-air. Furthermore, the engine was highly sensitive to negative G-forces. If a pilot pushed the nose down too sharply, air bubbles could enter the fuel lines, leading to a catastrophic engine failure known as a flame-out. At 1:45 p.m., after the frantic 8-minute combat window had closed, the pilot faced his greatest challenge. The Komet was now a heavy glider, and it had to land on a retractable steel skid. If any residual fuel remained in the tanks, which was common due to the uneven consumption rates, the jolt of landing could mix the remnants of the T-stuff and C-stuff. The resulting explosion would often vaporize the aircraft and its occupant instantly. There are harrowing accounts of ground crews reaching a crashed Komet only to find the pilot had been partially dissolved by leaking T-stuff before they could open the canopy. This was the brutal paradox of the Walter engine. It offered the ultimate high ground advantage, while simultaneously acting as a predatory force against the very men who flew it. As we reflect on the engineering of the Walter rocket motor, we are forced to confront the dark intersection of innovation and desperation. The Me 163 was not merely an aircraft. It was a symptom of a regime that had run out of time and moral restraint. Its engine was a technical marvel that paved the way for the vertical climbs of the space race. Yet it remains a haunting monument to a philosophy that treated human beings as expendable buffers between volatile chemicals and the machinery of war. The legacy of the Komet is not found in its meager kill count, but in the terrifying silence that followed its roar, a silence that speaks of the cost of pursuing power at the expense of the soul. It stands as a chilling reminder that the most advanced technology is a failure if it loses sight of the fragile lives it was meant to serve. August 16, 1944, at the Brandes airfield near Leipzig, a Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet sat vibrating with a primordial energy that no other aircraft in the world could match. To the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 400, the machine was a beautiful, lethal arrow, but to the chemists at Peenemünde, it was a volatile pressure cooker. At the heart of this aeronautical gamble were two liquids that defied the very laws of safety. The first was T-stuff, a solution of 80% hydrogen peroxide. This was not the mild antiseptic found in a modern medicine cabinet. This was a concentrated oxidant so powerful it would spontaneously ignite upon contact with any organic material, including cloth, leather, or human skin. The second was C-stuff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol. On their own, they were toxic. Together, they were hypergolic, meaning they exploded into flame the millisecond they touched. The pilots were quite literally sitting in a bathtub of potential annihilation. Directly behind the pilot's head sat a main T-stuff tank, while C-stuff was stored in the wings and around the cockpit floor. The plumbing connecting these components was often rudimentary, relying on seals and gaskets that were frequently degraded by the very chemicals they were meant to contain. If a single drop of T-stuff leaked onto the pilot's flight suit, it would initiate a rapid oxidation process that could turn a man into a torch in seconds. This was the terrifying reality of the rocket fighter, a weapon where the fuel was as dangerous as the enemy. To combat this, the Luftwaffe issued specialized protective suits made of mepolum, a type of early PVC. These suits were supposed to be impervious to the corrosives, but in reality, they were a secondary death trap. They were stiff, uncomfortable, and offered no ventilation. On a hot summer afternoon, say at 3 p.m. on a crowded tarmac, a pilot would be drenched in sweat before he even climbed into the cockpit. The salt in that sweat could react with trace residues, and the suit itself was so cumbersome it hindered the pilot's ability to escape in an emergency. If a leak occurred during flight, the suit often failed at the seams. Or worse, it acted as a funnel, trapping the caustic fuel against the skin and accelerating the chemical reaction. The most harrowing account of this chemical horror occurred during a routine landing. When a Komet returned to base, it did so as a glider. It landed on a retractable skid rather than wheels. If the landing was too hard, the impact could rupture the remaining residue in the tanks. In one specific instance, a pilot performed what appeared to be a perfect landing, but his skid collapsed upon contact with the uneven grass. The aircraft didn't explode, but the T-stuff tank behind his seat ruptured. When the ground crew reached the aircraft just 5 minutes later, at 11:45 a.m., they found a scene that would haunt them forever. The pilot was still strapped into his leather harness, But his body had effectively been liquefied by the overwhelming chemical flood. The T-stuff had reacted with his flesh, dissolving him into a gelatinous mass. His bones, stripped of their calcium by the intense chemical reaction, had become as soft as rubber. This was the hidden price of the rocket fighter. It wasn't just the risk of being shot down. It was the reality of being dissolved by the very machine you were sworn to fly. The engineering of the Me 163 was a triumph of aerodynamics and a failure of humanity. It treated the cockpit not as a sanctuary, but as a test tube for a desperate regime. The scientists knew the risks. They understood the chemistry. Yet, they continued to ess young men into the stratosphere encased in materials that offered nothing more than the illusion of safety. Every time a pilot stepped into that cockpit at 9 a.m., he was engaging in a form of chemical Russian roulette. The Komet was a weapon of the future built with the ethics of a dark age. It stands as a testament to what happens when technical superiority is divorced from the preservation of life. Ultimately, the Me 163 was a failure because it forgot that a machine is only as good as the man who survives it. The legacy of those who dissolved in the cockpits of Brandis is a sobering one. It reminds us that any progress bought with the literal dissolution of human beings is no progress at all. It is a hollow victory, a flash of fire followed by a long, caustic silence. The rocket engine's roar was a siren song that led an entire generation of elite pilots into a chemical abyss, leaving behind only the memory of a machine that ate its own creators. This remains the true, corrosive cost of the Komet and its dark legacy. August 16, 1944. Over the industrial landscapes of Saxony, the crew of a B-17 Flying Fortress scanned the horizon for the familiar silhouettes of Messerschmitt 109s. But what they encountered instead defied the very laws of aerial warfare. It is 11 a.m. when the first silver streak appears, moving at a velocity so profound it seems to tear the sky itself. This was the moment the theoretical nightmare of the Messerschmitt 163 Komet became a terrifying reality for the Allied bomber streams. The Komet pilot, squeezed into a cramped cockpit and smelling the faint, sickly scent of volatile chemicals, is not merely flying a fighter. He is riding a guided missile that has been barely tamed for human control. His ascent is a vertical sprint, a desperate 3-minute climb to 30,000 feet that pushes the human body to the absolute limits of endurance. As the Walter rocket motor roars with the fury of 1,000 furnaces, the pilot is pinned against his seat by forces that make breathing a secondary concern to survival. By 11:03 a.m., the Komet has reached the thin, freezing air of the upper atmosphere, having bypassed the entire screen of escorting P-51 Mustangs who could only watch in stunned silence as the rocket-powered interceptor shot past them like a stray bullet. Now, the pilot faces his greatest tactical hurdle, the closing speed. When you are traveling at nearly 600 miles per hour and your targets are lumbering along at 200, the window for a successful attack is measured in fractions of a heartbeat. The B-17s appear first as tiny dots, then suddenly they are massive, metal walls filling the entire windscreen. The pilot has less than 3 seconds to aim his 30mm cannons, fire a burst of heavy shells, and pull away before colliding with the very formation he is trying to destroy. It is a high-speed game of chicken where the slightest twitch of the controls results in a catastrophic overshoot or a fatal mid-air collision. The Mk108 cannons, known by the pilots as the jackhammer for their slow rate of fire and massive recoil, are ill-suited for this speed. A pilot might only get off 2 or 3 rounds before he has already zipped past the bomber's tail and is miles away in the blue expanse. At 11:05 a.m., the terrifying roar of the rocket engine abruptly dies. The silence that follows is deafening, marking the powered flight and the beginning of the Komet's transition into a heavy, unpowered glider. For the Allied gunners, the Komet is a ghost. It appears, strikes with the suddenness of lightning, and is gone before they can even rotate their turrets. But for the German pilot, the real danger is just beginning. He is now a high-altitude glider with the aerodynamic properties of a smoothed-over brick, desperately searching for a patch of grass to land on while Allied fighters circle below like sharks sensing blood in the water. The tactical brilliance of the Me-163 was negated by the sheer brevity of its existence in the air. You could climb faster than any aircraft in history, but you could only stay in the fight for the length of a cigarette break. This was the central tragedy of the Komet's design. It was a weapon of extreme performance that offered no margin for error and almost no opportunity for sustained combat. By 11:15 a.m., the lucky pilots were touching down on their skid landings at Brandis, while the unlucky ones were being picked out of the sky as they drifted helplessly toward the earth. The Me-163 was the ultimate expression of a regime that had run out of time, trying to substitute raw, dangerous speed for a cohesive defensive strategy. It was a machine that required its pilots to be both gods of the air and sacrificial lambs, pushing the envelope of physics until the envelope inevitably tore. As we look back at the charred remains and the terrifying flight logs of the rocket fighters, we are forced to confront the legacy of this desperate innovation. The Komet was not a herald of a new age of aviation, but rather a final, convulsive gasp of a dying air force. It proved that while you can build a machine to reach the speed of sound, you cannot build a human soul that remains unscarred by the velocity of such madness. The pilots who climbed into those cockpits knew that they were stepping into a coffin that might occasionally fly. They were the casualties of a scientific ambition that had decoupled itself from morality, chasing a technological miracle that could never change the outcome of the war. The Komet remains a poignant symbol of the futility of late-war German engineering, a streak of fire across a darkening sky, brilliant for a moment, and then extinguished forever in a cloud of caustic smoke and forgotten dreams. It is a reminder that the height of a climb is meaningless if the descent leads only to the abyss, leaving us to wonder at the cost of reaching for the stars when your feet are firmly planted in the ruins of a broken world. August 16, 1944, at the Brandis airfield near Leipzig. A lone Messerschmitt 163 Komet prepared for its vertical ascent, but the real danger was not the climb into the stratosphere, it was the inevitable return to the grass below. The Komet was a masterpiece of aerodynamic genius and chemical volatility. Yet its most glaring weakness lay in the moments when its speed dropped and its belly approached the earth. Because the aircraft was a pure rocket, every gram of weight was a penalty. To solve this, the engineers at Messerschmitt decided to forego a traditional heavy landing gear. Instead, the pilot took off using a jettisonable two-wheeled dolly. Once the aircraft reached an altitude of roughly 20 feet, usually around 1 p.m. under a clear summer sun, the pilot would pull a release lever. The heavy steel dolly would drop away, leaving the Komet to climb as a streamlined dart. However, this system was flawed from the very first seconds of flight. If the dolly was released too late, the aerodynamics of the climb were ruined. If it was released too early, the heavy wheels would bounce off the runway with such force that they could fly back up and strike the fragile wooden wings or the pressurized fuel tanks, turning a successful takeoff into a mid-air fireball before the pilot had even cleared the airfield perimeter. If the pilot survived the takeoff and the harrowing combat window, he faced a landing procedure that was less of a controlled descent and more of a high-stakes gamble. By 1:15 p.m., the fuel would be exhausted and the Komet would become a heavy, unpowered glider. The pilot had to judge his approach perfectly because there was no engine to provide a second chance. Beneath the fuselage sat a long, retractable metal skid. This skid was the Komet's only defense against the impact of landing, and it was notoriously unreliable. In theory, a hydraulic buffer was supposed to absorb the shock of the touchdown. In practice, the system was often stiff, poorly maintained, or simply overwhelmed by the weight of the aircraft. When the Komet hit the grass at over 100 miles per hour, the impact was transmitted directly through the airframe. Pilots reported that the force of a landing on the unbuffered skid felt like being struck by a sledgehammer. The jolt was frequently so severe that it caused spinal injuries, leaving men paralyzed even if the aircraft remained intact. The mechanical failure of the skid was compounded by the chemical nightmare of the rocket's propulsion system. The Komet was fueled by T-Stoff and C-Stoff, two liquids that reacted explosively upon contact. Even after a mission was completed, the tanks were never truly empty. Small pockets of residual fuel would slosh in the lines and at the bottom of the glass-lined containers. During a rough landing, the violent jarring of the unbuffered skid would often crack these tanks or rupture the fuel lines. If even a few drops of these chemicals met, the Komet would disintegrate in a blinding flash. There was no escape for the pilot, strapped into the cockpit, just inches away from the reaction. Furthermore, T-Stoff, which was 80% hydrogen peroxide, was incredibly corrosive. If a leak occurred during a hard landing that didn't immediately cause an explosion, the pilot faced a fate perhaps even more horrific. The chemical would vaporize and fill the cockpit, dissolving organic matter. Ground crews at Brandis recounted the harrowing discovery of a pilot whose aircraft had performed a seemingly survivable landing, only to find the man inside had been reduced to a gelatinous sludge because a T-Stoff line had ruptured upon impact with the ground. By 2 p.m. on days of heavy activity, the airfields were often scarred with the deep ruts of unsuccessful landings. The Komet had no steering once it was on its skid. If a crosswind caught the vertical stabilizer, or if one wing dipped slightly too low, the aircraft would perform a violent ground loop, cartwheeling across the field. Because the skid provided no lateral stability, the pilot was a passenger to physics once the metal touched the earth. This lack of control turned every return to base into a desperate struggle against a momentum. The pilots were elite, the bravest of the Luftwaffe, yet they were betrayed by a design that treated the landing as an afterthought. The tragedy of the Me 163's landing system is a microcosm of the entire Third Reich's military philosophy in the final years of the war. It was a pursuit of the spectacular at the expense of the sustainable. Engineers reached for the sound barrier and the edge of space while neglecting the basic necessity of a safe return. The Komet was a weapon that killed its own more effectively than it killed the enemy, a machine that demanded everything and offered no margin for error. As we reflect on the smoldering remains of these rocket fighters, we see more than just a failed experiment in aviation. We see the cost of a desperation that prioritized the machine over the man and speed over survival. The unbuffered skid and the jettisonable wheels remain a haunting legacy of a time when the brilliance of human ingenuity was twisted toward self-destruction. It reminds us that any leap forward, no matter how fast or how high, is ultimately a failure if it leaves no path for a safe return to the world we inhabit. The Komet's final touchdown was not just a landing, it was a violent collision between the future of technology and the cold, hard reality of a broken world. May 1945, at the derelict airfield of Bad Zwischenahn, the silence of the North German plains was finally unbroken by the banshee shriek of the Walter rocket engine. British and American soldiers stood in a quiet, uneasy awe before a machine that looked like it belonged to a different century. The Messerschmitt 163 Komet sat abandoned on its landing skid, its nose pointed toward a sky it would never again haunt. To the soldiers, it was a curiosity, a stubby, wing-heavy craft that seemed far too small to be a weapon of war. But to the history of aviation, it was a monument to a terrifying kind of genius. This was the final stop for a project that had promised to change the face of aerial combat, only to become a haunting symbol of a regime's frantic, self-destructive descent into the abyss. The Komet was never just an airplane. It was the physical manifestation of a philosophy that prioritized the miracle over the methodical. In the final years of the conflict, the German High Command was obsessed with the idea of the wonder weapon. They believed that a single leap in technology could offset the overwhelming industrial might of the Allies. But the Me 163 proved that technology, without a foundation of safety and human concern, is merely a faster way to reach the grave. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, featuring a revolutionary tailless design and swept-back wings that allowed it to approach the sound barrier at a time when most of the world was still perfecting the propeller. Yet, for every step it took into the future, it took 2 steps back into a primal, chemical nightmare. The pilots who climbed into that cramped cockpit were some of the bravest and most desperate men of the Luftwaffe. They knew that when the clock struck 10 a.m. and they were cleared for takeoff, they were not just entering a battle against B-17 bombers, but a battle against the laws of physics and the volatile nature of their own fuel. The T-stuff and C-stuff that powered the rocket engine were so corrosive that they could dissolve human flesh upon contact. There are accounts of pilots who survived a landing only to be liquefied in their seats because a fuel line ruptured. This was the true cost of the Komet's speed. It was a machine that demanded everything from its operator while offering almost nothing in return. As the war drew to a close, the Komet's legacy began to shift from a weapon of defense to a relic of intense curiosity. Allied intelligence officers scrambled to seize the remaining airframes, shipping them back to the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. At 2:30 p.m. on a clear afternoon in late 1945, British test pilot Eric Brown climbed into a captured Komet to experience the power for himself. He described the acceleration as a wild, uncontrollable force, a sensation of being strapped to a runaway train that wanted to leave the Earth behind. But even Brown, one of the most experienced pilots in history, recognized the inherent madness of the design. He saw it for what it was, a desperate gamble by a nation that had run out of time and morality. The tragedy of the Komet is that its brilliance was harnessed for such a dark purpose. Alexander Lippisch, the man behind the design, was a visionary who saw the potential for delta wings long before they became standard. His work would eventually help pave the way for the space shuttle and the supersonic interceptors of the Cold War. But in the context of the Second World War, his vision was twisted into a suicide machine. The Komet didn't save Germany's cities from the firestorms, nor did it turn the tide of the air war. Instead, it claimed the lives of the very pilots it was meant to empower, often in ways that were too horrific to describe in official reports. When we reflect on the Me-163, we are looking at the ultimate expression of technological ambition divorced from human value. It serves as a haunting reminder that progress is not measured solely by how fast we can go or how high we can climb. It is measured by whether we can return. The Komet was a one-way trip into the future, a machine that broke records but also broke the men who trusted it. It stands as a warning to every engineer and every leader that the brilliance of a machine is hollow if it does not cherish the life of the person inside it. In the Komet was a flare in the night, bright, terrifying, and gone in an instant. It represented the moment when the pursuit of the impossible became a path to self-destruction. As the sun set at 6 p.m. over the ruins of the Third Reich, the Komet remained on the ground, a silent witness to the folly of placing metal above morale. Its legacy is a complicated tapestry of awe and horror, a reminder that the most dangerous flaw in any design is the one that forgets the pilot is human. We honor the ingenuity of the design, but we must never forget the desperation that gave it flight. The Komet was a masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece built on the edge of an abyss, and in its reflection, we see the true cost of reaching for the heavens while losing our soul on Earth.